Discussing the concept of developed and developing nations. As we discuss this concept, it is important for us to ask, what is the difference between developed and developing nations? Examples of most developed and developing nations include many countries in Europe, the United States, Canada, and Japan. Sometimes developed nations are referred to as first world countries, but it isn't considered polite. It's a little, ethnocentric sounding. Developing nations can be divided into two different groups, those with little development and those with almost none. Countries with some development, called second world nations by those impolite people, are sometimes called BRICS nations. Countries with little development include nations like Nigeria and Afghanistan. As we look at these examples, a pattern begins to form. The nations with the most development are ones that industrialized first, and it is no coincidence that these nations were often colonized during the age of imperialism. Those with little to no industrialization. Developing nations were those that became colonies during the age of imperialism, which was from 1887 to 1914. Industrialization is part of modernization. Modernization is the goal for all nations. To be modernized, a nation needs a stable government, a lot of different goods produced, and different services offered. Modernization is the difference between developed and developing nations. There's a simple equation to help you remember this concept. Countries with stronger economies often have a diverse and more stable government. Stable governments usually exist in developed nations and are usually democratic and have smooth transitions of power. Remember in 2016, the United States transferred power from President Barack Obama to President Donald Trump? The transition was smooth. During the inauguration, the Obamas were moved out and the Trumps were moved into the White House. In developing nations, the transition is, a little less smooth. Power is often followed by unrest when leaders are chosen anti-democratically. In these countries, leaders often seize power and are overthrown violently. For example, what happened in Libya and in Egypt in the mid-2010s. The second difference between developed and developing nations is the economic system. In developed nations, there is a diverse economy where a variety of goods and services are produced and sold. This allows a government to survive when a problem arises, whereas in developing nations, they function on a natural resource-based economy. Some examples of natural resource-based economies are cash crops like coffee, tea, and bananas, or natural resources like oil, gold, or coal. An economic failure could result in a lower demand for one of these products, or if a natural disaster happens, all the products could be destroyed. Once an economy fails, people often demand change, which could be violent. This is why weak economies unfortunately lead to unstable governments and civil unrest. The legacy of imperialism, as oftentimes colonies only grew a handful of crops or produced resources for European factories only, whereas, on the other hand, diverse economies often lead to strong governments. Education also plays an important role in developed and developing nations. In developed nations, there are high literacy rates, which is the ability to read and write, leading to the ability for specialized skills, which are important for an advanced economy. Think doctors, lawyers, or even teachers. In developing nations, literacy rates are often low. Citizens need money, so they work rather than go to school. Often these jobs do not require the same specialized skills, for example, farming. In developed countries, the role of women is different. Many women are not at home, they work, are more educated, marry later, and have fewer children. People put more energy into each one of their children. For example, France spends more per child in education than countries like India or Nigeria, even though their populations are larger. As you can imagine, countries that are developing often have poorer medical conditions and fewer doctors. So it should not be a surprise to us that France has higher spending on education and lower fertility rates than India and Nigeria. Because tradition is important and the government cannot meet the needs of their citizens, this forces many children to work. Parents tend to have more children to help care for the family, but more children drives each family deeper into poverty. And the last difference between developed and developing nations is the role of debt. Most governments are in debt, even developed ones. Debt is owing more money than you currently have. Developed nations, because they sell more products and have wealthier citizens, can more easily raise money to pay off their debt. Developing nations are given loans through organizations like the World Bank. Those loans have high interest rates. High interest rates mean you have to pay a lot more money to repay your debt. High debt and high interest rates often drain economies. Instead of improving healthcare or education, developing nations must repay their high interest loans, driving the nations deeper into poverty. So remember, developing nations are categorized by a high degree of modernization, often with stable governments and strong economies. Developing nations are in the process of becoming modernized, often with less stable governments and traditional economies. This has been a World Cultures production.